everybody read this section because I think it's a very important section for everybody to learn about CPR settings. Last time we discussed a bunch of different CPR settings and tried to look at them as examples of what a sustainable CPR setting looked like. And so we went over several different ones of them. And in this part of the section, Ostrom tries to rationalize why these CPR settings are sustainable and others have not been. And so during this task, she acknowledges that the settings, both culturally and from the appropriation rules around the CPR settings, are extremely different, but they're all very sustainable. And she's trying to figure out some type of universal characteristic that each of these settings hold that contribute to their sustainability and what she calls the institutional robustness of that CPR setting. And so she sets out a set of 8 design principles that I think we should all discuss and talk about one by one, because I think that's probably the best way to do it. And I think it gives us a really good tool to start developing this kind of commons mindset. When we look at commons, what we think about, how we think about what the resource units are, who the actors are. And so the more we do this, I think if you put it into your own words, into your own experiences, it can be something as easily as looking back on your first apartment with somebody that you shared an apartment with, and looking at the food that's coming in and saying, okay, these are my resource units, and how do I set up these design principles? How would I design this to make it more sustainable for all of us to live here? And so just putting these types of design principles and setting it into your own experiences, I think, can help you develop that type of mindset, that commons mindset. So when we are looking at real CPR situations, we know what we're looking for, and we know how to have a conversation around those certain variables. And so with that being said, what I was hoping that we could do is we'll go through the design principles one by one. And if you guys want to pipe up about like an experience you've had or the way you see it, please share. So we'll go for the first one, which is clearly defined boundaries. And these clearly defined boundaries that Ostrom discusses are not only of the system itself, but of the appropriators who use that system. And so if anybody has any thoughts on the first design principle, please go ahead.
I was thinking about what are sometimes it's not that easy to identify what are the benefits we produce when we are not in a very physical, concrete environment. So that was a question I posed myself here to think in the TEC perspective, but also in general for multiple DAOs. Like, what are the benefits produced by the community? And I think benefits and values might be synonyms, but maybe not in terms of resources, because thinking that these boundaries would exclude others from accessing the appropriation rights, like she mentions. So what are the appropriations rights protecting in this sense? It was just an open question for me to think about it.
Yeah, I think that's kind of interesting because, you say, the setting the boundaries of the appropriators and who's able to use this. When we talk about the networks that we have, whether it's the TEC or something, you want it to be as open as possible. And clearly defining those boundaries can include that inclusion, but it has to also include the rights that are, they're the operational rules associated with those rights according to new members and how they are introduced into to the community, which is, I don't know, it goes on to some more of the other design principles that she has as well.
I'll jump in. So I like this, her clear description of boundaries. Boundaries is something we all deal with in relationships, in geographical space, and in every aspect of our lives. And it's intuitively clear that in order to manage or govern something, you need to know what it is that you're governing and who has access to it. But I like the way she talks about, and I had to look this up, when she talks about discount rate, which is, the rate, it's basically like, low versus high time preference. So it's like, well, there's a value in receiving something earlier, and the discount rate for, what did she say? The higher the discount rate, the closer the situation is to that of a one-shot dilemma, in which the dominant strategy of all participants is to overuse the CPR. And it's sort of, it touches on a mindset of boundaries too, which is that, the ability to delay gratification or delay using of a space in order for that space to benefit for a sustainable period for duration. So I really like that she brings in the idea like low time preference is necessary in order for commons to thrive. High time preference will eliminate the commons because everybody will want it right now and all of it right now and consume everything. So I really like that aspect when she elaborates on this one principle.
Yeah, I see what you mentioned in there, because sustainability, as I see it, is what you do in the little time frames, how it affects to the global, to the extent, to the long term, whatever it's going to happen to the resource or the value that you are generating right now. So it's the tough question in there is where to set the red line, where to set the limit on how much you are using, or when is too much, or when you are not benefiting, or when are you taking from the others when you shouldn't. So that distinction can get really complicated to distinct, and that's why I think she makes the difference that every context or every problem has its own way to solve an issue.
Yeah, I just want to say welcome to Kate, Kimberly, James, Beretta. We started just like 5 minutes ago. And to comment on that you said, Mateo, I feel like I also thought a lot along those lines of how to manage this, the amount of resources and the people that want to use those resources. And I thought if it would be interesting to have to have some type of rule that you can only request an X amount of the total. So like proposals could only request a percentage of the total. And if their proposal is very high, then the DAO would have to have more funds in order for that proposal to exist, even though the funds exist, but because that would harm the potential of other groups to also make proposals.
Yeah, and so I think that the first design principle, especially about clearly setting boundaries, we talk about what kind of rights are endowed to the individual, whether you're an appropriate or a provisional individual. But we don't really talk about a lot is the clearly defined boundaries of the system, and and what she means by that in terms of a CPR setting. Does anybody have any examples of a clearly defined boundary of a CPR setting within the system itself?
I mean, I think in a lot of the examples outlined, there were rules that only the locals could, participate. Or if you were from the outside coming in, you had to agree to the local rules before you'd be allowed in. I think with one of them in the Philippines, like that was a requirement before you could buy land. And I think with the Swiss one as well, there's a requirement around that, around how land or rights access was uh, passed down through generations. So I think in the examples outlined, there were some pretty clear boundaries around like the locality of that. Is that the question you were asking?
It is, yeah, because a lot of the, especially in this first design principle, when we think about this, most participants within the system, they've inherited these things. Not many of them had the opportunity to consciously say, okay, let's define the boundaries of the system and the boundaries and the rights of the individuals or the groups. They've inherited a cultural system that dictated these operational rules and these clearly defined boundaries. But for some reason, that the origin of these boundaries were set and defined, and it's very hard to explain. And I think that the boundaries of the system were a huge part of that, dictating the actual boundaries and the rights of the individual actors.
Yeah, totally. And I think somewhere like towards 95 or somewhere around there, she actually talks about this because she's like, hey, one of the things with the CPRs is that it's really helpful when communities come together to make the rules themselves. So the people using the thing and monitoring the thing help manage the thing. As you mentioned, like on a lot of these cases, people inherited it. They weren't there to create the rules in the first place. So then why do they follow the rules? And I think she outlined a few things, which is like um, they're thinking long term, so they know that their children or their families or whatever are going to be using this resource for a while, so they care about participating. And then also, I think she mentioned like the social norms around it, in that like even though the fines and penalties generally weren't super high, because there was a social aspect around it with reputation and stuff, and because the rules were slightly lenient based on the circumstance at the time dictated by the people, people were more likely to participate just out of the cultural norms and being part of that local tribe, and then thinking long term about that tribe. So I think those were the points you mentioned, but I don't know if anyone else remembers any others that were relevant.
Yeah, and I think and she keeps elaborating on these those aspects of CPR design as she goes on, and I just wanted to reiterate that the purpose of these. So she says that these design principles are to constitute a credible explanation for the persistence of CPRs after generation of people, and she needs to prove that they can affect the incentives in such a way that appropriators will conform to the operational rules, effectively monitor their conformance, and replicate these CPR institutions across generational boundaries. And so the first one is, like we talked about right now, is clearly defined boundaries. And we'll move on to the second one, which is congruence between appropriation and provision rules and local conditions. So if anybody has any examples of that they want to talk about.
Can you just restate the topic? You're muted, Nathan.
Sorry about that. The second design principle is the congruence between appropriation and provision rules and local conditions. So essentially, it's just saying that there's appropriation rules that are associated with the time and place and technology of the resource around how you provide and appropriate that CPR unit. And so, yeah, if anybody has any comments on that.
I mean, I think, and this might kind of segue into monitoring a bit, but like, as far as like the structure of the CPRs and how the appropriation works, it seems like one thing that was common in a lot of these cases is that they were set up such that the people appropriating were very kind of in close contact. So like for the water, you could see the farmer next to you, right, or the one downstream. Or in the meadow, you could see the cows coming onto the meadow and going off. Or in the Japanese example where they like clear the grass or whatever they were doing, everyone would get together to do it at the same time, so you could see who's there. And so it kind of seems like one of the things that's really helpful in these CPRs is that everyone has a view of the system, like they kind of know the information and they know that everyone else knows the rules, and then they all together in some way do the thing together, or at least in some kind of close contact, so that there's constant information exchange between all the players. That seemed to be a recurring theme across the different CPR examples, I think.
Yeah.
I guess I'll add to this the importance of the appropriators, creating and changing the rules based on their particular set of circumstances. And in our last book club, we sort of talked about how some of the rules vary depending on the particular amount of rainfall for a year, or the climate conditions, the changing climate conditions and droughts and floods. And the rules are super adaptable based on the needs at a certain specific time and under certain external conditions. And I think this rule really highlights that there are certain rules, and they have to be adaptable based on the changing needs. And there's no one rule that will work for every CPR. Every CPR needs to determine their own local rules for themselves.
I think that happens a lot, quite often, especially when water management systems, when we talk about the inconsistency of the supply of water from year to year. And so the local conditions will have to dictate how not only the process, but the technology we use, how much water we consume, who consumes it, how we budget it. It dictates a lot of things. And so we have to take local conditions into context when designing a CPR setting or looking at how successful CPRs have existed in the past. And they all have the ability and the flexibility and the adaptability to change to changes within their local environment. And I think that is a huge impact on whether it sustains generation after generation, and teaching those ability to adapt to each generation is a very difficult thing to do. But I think it's kind of built into the culture and the appropriation rules defined around it.
Yeah, and I think that kind of points to the higher level kind of concept of like pushing governance to the edges. Because one of the things that it talks about kind of the layers of design, right? And so you've kind of got like the institutional design, which is like the higher level governance, and then you have the like kind of commons governance, which is how a region or a village or whatever might manage a thing, and then you've got the individual level where how people interact. And so like you can have kind of the higher level rules for the system, but then for actual like decision making, it gets more granular and pushed to the edges, so people at a local level, based on the context of the time, can kind of iterate around those rules to apply them as best for them. And it seems kind of part of that trend that she highlighted in a page that I don't remember.
It is, yeah. And did anybody else have anything to say about our second design principle?
I just thought there was a cool point that ties with Principle 5 of graduated sanctions, that the rules should take in consideration this equilibria of the system, on how like there is a balance between everything that it's being provided to everything that it's being taken. And then in Principle 5, she talks like how all adult male patrolled the dikes every night in mutual surveillance until the emergency was over. And that made me think that recognizing an emergency state might be useful, since the stage of making the rules for when something like this happens, there is like there is a collective agreement that everyone should be acting in pro of the system existing in that moment.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to see how connected all of these design principles are in terms of like if you design one, it enforces the design of the other, especially when it comes to setting the rules. Because you talk about I think she mentioned at one point about I think it goes together, the design principle of monitoring and graduating sanctions, that you have this design of where the person who is most vulnerable is the one who is watching out and monitoring the people that are taking it before them. And so this is a design of setting of time and place where the farmer says the person who is getting water after you is having to monitor you. And so if you take too much, then they're gonna call you out. They have an incentive to call you out because you're taking away water from them. And if they want to encourage you to leave early, so you want to take the amount of water that you want and need for yourself. And so this kind of balanced design within these common pool resources are really interesting, because they each build on top of each other, these design principles. And so the third design principle that we would talk about is the most individuals affected by the operational rules can participate in modifying the operational rules. So this is kind of like this collective choice arrangement. Does anybody have anything to say about that one?
I want to participate, but the idea that I have is not punctually on the principle number 3 that we are addressing, but it's like a connection of some ideas that I've had like during the week. And on Saturday we had Friday we had a really good talk with Sam, and he like explained us with a very allegorical language what can be the application of bonding curves and conviction voting for CPR institutions. So, like for me, until I heard that like metaphor, it was never so much clear to me, like what the opportunity that we have right now, that through the technology we can make CPR institutions, decentralized CPR institutions, that and for me that is really amazing. And he like had the example of a garden, and he said like a garden had their own spirits, and these are like the token holders that can stand for the garden. And I think that allegory of the garden is really good for addressing the principle number 1 and 2, because what defines the boundary of the garden is when you can become like a spirit of the garden, when you can enter and participate in the spirits that are taking the decision and who yield for the benefit of the garden. And that also leads to congruence between appropriation and provision, because the spirits of the garden, as they yield for the benefit of the garden, they won't damage the garden, even though they want also to profit them, each of them. So yeah, I don't want to extend too much on this because I think that we have to go on with the principles. But it would be really nice to like listen again and to like go further with this allegorical language that eases a lot the comprehension on what we're doing and the connection between Ostrom principles and what we are doing, the CPRS and the tech.
Yeah, I'm extremely excited about bonding curves and their application into the common setting. I think they are phenomenal, and they touch on to each principle, and I think the third one especially, because the third one is simply about reducing the cost of managing the commons. How do we keep things easy and for things to change for individuals like yourself or anybody who wants to participate in the commons to actively manage and influence the commons? And how do we keep those operational costs really, really low so that changes to the system can be made without huge efforts? If you have an idea about the commons, you can say, okay, I want to apply, a voting or a funding system around it. And I, use a token bonding curve for that, quadratic, whatever. And you apply that to it. And guess what? Now you have the ability for tons of people to participate and change the rules of the system for the sustainability of it in the long term. And I think that, when we apply all these design principles and set them against what we all foresee as being the future of commons management in terms of the technology that we're trying to use, I think it's hugely beneficial. And so, I don't know if anybody wants to elaborate on that as well.
Yeah. So, quick plug on, I guess, bonding curves and gardens and etc. So, like, the bonding curve is awesome because it creates that like barrier, and that permissionless entry exit. But one thing that's kind of different from that versus the CPRs that we're exploring here is that bonding curves are permissionless and CPRs are permissioned. So in the CPR, like there's like a local context, and to participate in that, you have to be part of the village. You have to agree to their rules. It's like a whole thing, right? With bonding curve, it's cool, but it's like more like a shares in a company. Anyone can buy them, then you can vote, la di da. So if you're going to have like a more CPR style bonding curve garden situation, you probably want to incorporate reputation so that there's a mix between assets, similar to how people have land or cows or whatever, and reputation, meaning like your lineage in that community. And the amount that you've like shown up and contributed. So that way it's not just based on who has the most collateral to throw around. So that's one of the things in the CPR is just like external people couldn't just come in and buy up all the land. They had to play by these rules that were governed by the local community, which was based on their lineage and reputation and social norms and etc. So something to think about in the context of building digital commons.
Hey, okay, so I'm kind of like just recently joined this DAO book club. I have not read the book, so I don't want to weigh down the conversation with my ignorance. And I'd also be interested if anyone has time at the end of this call to kind of fill me in more on this group. I got connected through Aaron Soskin, and I'm planning to also join the call tonight about the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers. But like on this point, for again, taking my lack of understanding, which actually question, I would be curious if someone could at least fill me in on what CPR stands for in this context. I think like the the point about like people who are affected by the rules can take part in the rules stands out to me as something that's like the key issue in potentially like the key issue in America today. And I think it's like especially interesting to consider. I've heard quadratic voting, which is something that I recently learned about. But I'm definitely like approaching all these ideas with an eye toward like what is actually practically implementable today, because we need
change today. And something that strikes me about quadratic voting is just like its complexity and perhaps the difficulty of people to understand it versus something like ranked choice voting, which even that some people think is difficult to understand. So curious if what people's thoughts are on that.
Just a quick definition: CPR is common pool resource, which is a non-excludable resource that is rivalrous, where basically if like fish in a lake, if you fish out, no one can stop you from fishing really, but if you take all the fish, then everyone else suffers. So that's what CPR is.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah. So we're going to move on to the fourth and fifth design principle that Ostrom sets out. These two are kind of connected in a lot of ways. It's monitoring and graduated sanctions. And these are pretty fundamental to designing a sustainable CPR setting, because without monitoring and having some type of enforcement or teeth to that monitoring, people are going to behave opportunistically. And so that is kind of one of the big ideas, is trying to figure out the incentives for people to, think about longer term decision making rather than behaving opportunistically and living for that, the moment. The appropriators who violate the operational rules are very, they're not necessarily evil people. They're participating in a system that allows them to do this, and we see this all the time within the CPR settings all over the globe right now. We give them the opportunity and the window to take advantage of these systems, and without any enforcement or without any rearranging of incentives, they're allowed to perpetuate it over and over again. So if anybody has any comments on these two design principles, please go ahead.
Yeah, I mentioned this on the call we had before, but it caught my attention how she used the term suckers a lot to talk about like how people feel like complying with rules if others are also complying, and that the main aspect of someone not complying with rules is that they don't want to be the losers of that situation. So she introduces this idea of the quasi-voluntary compliance, that basically means the compliance of each depends on the compliance of the others. So having a system that informs a lot and that makes people like feel like they're always on the same page would help a lot with mutual accountability.
And she uses taxes as an example of that, and I think that's a really, really good example, because nobody wants to pay taxes, but we pay them because everybody else pays them. And if you don't, you're going to be the one who calls, who doesn't do it and gets in trouble for it. But if everybody said, no, we're not paying taxes, well, then you have a crisis on your hands. And so that type of quasi-voluntary compliance is very, very important for the sustainability of the government and state itself. So.
And I also want to emphasize on the scope of the graduate sanctions. I think that the scope of the graduate sanctions is not to punish people, but to correct behavior. Here she says, let's put ourselves in the situation of someone who breaks the rules and is informed to the monitors by other person. So she says, one, it will stop the infraction from continuing. Two, it will convey information to the offender that someone else is in a similar situation and is likely to be caught. And also increases the confidences of level of what Livia was saying of quasi-voluntarily compliance, and a punishment plus loss of reputation is a way for the offender to learn what the community and what the CPR is expecting from him. So it's like our initial reaction when we hear the word sanctions is always like negative, but we should like try to see this word as she explains it in a really broader significance, that she's telling it as just a way of implementing what is like expected and what is not.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it, especially monitoring graduated sanctions, when we look at these types of systems, and she mentions it within the chapter, but like keeping the costs down of almost everything is extremely important to creating a sustainable CPR environment. Keeping the costs down for monitoring, keeping the costs down for enforcement, keeping the costs down for changing the operational rules of the system itself. I think that keeping the costs down for everyone, every aspect involved, makes the system a lot more adaptable to changes. And even if you do have people who are acting opportunistically, you can easily, refine that system without having to, completely rehaul everything. And so I think a lot of the problems that we have in today's modern CPR setting is that it is very costly to monitor. It is very costly to enforce. And so when either one of those things lacks, you have an insufficient system, because at the end of the day, what good is a law if nobody's there to enforce it? Like, you can have as many rules as you want, but if there's nobody there to enforce it, then it's kind of pointless. And I think that's something to really take into consideration when we think about design principles and looking at CPR settings and saying, okay, what are the incentives here for others? What are the monitoring costs? What are the enforcement costs? Are they congruent with each other?
I think while I was reading this, that also struck me too, specifically where she speaks about, two things. It's actually another researcher, Elster, who states that punishment almost invariably is costly to the punisher, while the benefits from punishment are diffusely distributed over the members. And, immediately I thought, oh, wow, sanctions is a common good. That like the punisher is taking on the responsibility to produce better results for the common good. And then later on that same page, she talks about, or Ostrom talks about the low cost of like how the low cost can be achieved by the motivations of each of the participants. And if your motivation is to make sure you get your fair share, then you are sort of monitoring the other people in some context. And she speaks about the water rotations to ensure that everyone has, they're motivated to have the fullest extent of what they think is their fair share. And that's one way to, like, the motivation of the participants is one way to keep to maintain the low cost, because you don't need to have employ outside efforts to continue monitoring. This was a very, surprisingly, I think this is the longest, the graduated sanctions is the longest of all of these principles. And I found it very meaty, actually.
And it was very interesting to see that monitoring was just a small paragraph. And she's like, yeah, monitor the stuff. Like you got to do that. But here's how it works. And so the graduated sections things was very interesting about.
In that sense, I believe that she in some points mentions that a strategy is like a needed ability for everyone in the system to have, for the system to be actually sustainable. So if you are going to assume the role of monitor and appropriator at the same time, you really need to have the strategy to know when to not be a sucker and to know when you are actually being right. So in an example of our current society, I like to think about that in how we are seeing the ethics and the moral in general. So if everyone has really good ethics, maybe the moral shapes itself with everyone's ethics. So in this system, if everyone is doing things right and the system is looking is getting benefits from it, so that says that the rule is actually working. But if the system is actually going down and nothing is working, maybe the rules are wrong. Why not? So that morale can reshape into the efforts of how everyone is actually working and how everyone maybe is stopping being a sucker and maybe trying to be better. And going into that part, the value of information. She says that the high cost of monitoring and giving sanctions is that the perception of that everyone is acting rightfully or wrongly can make consequences on how you are offering value to the whole system. So I like to that chapter in particular really that point in particular, that principle in particular made me think a lot of that on how the individual positions or how the individual uh, decisions can impact the whole system.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yes. I'm just jumping in, not having fully read the whole book by Ostrom, but having jumped in and out of some commoning thinking over the last few years. But I just wanted to mention that it's really important to apply one of the first principles, which is when talking about monitoring and graduated sanctions, which is that every commons is context dependent. All rules for every commons are context dependent. And the context of many of the case studies, thinking about Filipino irrigation systems and people monitoring water use, the monitoring would be nested in a very strong cultural situation where it's not just people looking at how much water is being taken and used, but it's a part of like the whole system of life. It's nested in water festivals and seasonal celebration and all of the fabric that unites that community in order within boundaries and within, I don't know, the invisible bonds that enable them to do common pool management, because it's not like there's this behavior of just setting and adjusting rules and monitoring and graduating different sanctions when people are misappropriating. And to be honest, I find some of the language of Ostrom very economistic in terms of like appropriating the resource. That's all very nested in a social system where it's I feel like there's a different social context for digital commons, which is important to really consider what's holding the monitoring of overuse of resources or commons in that digital context. That's all I wanted to say, and thanks for having me. Nice to be here.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I agree with you. I think we often look at commons and we place it, the social context of commons, and we nestle it inside the economic characteristics of the commons instead of vice versa. And a lot of times we kind of ignore the aspect of like the economic is nestled within the social aspect of it. And I think that type of back and forth is very important to really acknowledge when discussing this. And one of the aspects that especially on a social local level, where you have to include local conditions is that you have to use reputation, and she talks about this Ostrom talks about this in graduated sanctions, and that reputation is very important to kind of defer consistent abuses of the system, and it kind of leads into our sixth design principle of conflict resolution mechanisms, and how we go about dealing with people who are, violating these operational rules that we set out for the CPR setting, whether it's on a global scale or just on a local situation. So anybody has any comments about that one?
I think there is something she mentioned in the last chapter, I think, that she talks about when someone infracts, goes against, it breaks a rule of the system, and the punishment on them is too hard, that might make them feel resentment towards the whole system, because sometimes it's some type of emergency that they went through to act in a way that goes against the system most optimal desires. So I like that she says here mechanisms that that we should have mechanisms that will allow them to make up for their lack of performance. And I like how it comes from this word allowance. It's like it's making it so it's in their desire to make up and make and have and give a fair action to the system, and it's not seen as like punishment, as something that is severe. Instead is like giving the opportunity for the person to feel good with the collective.
Yeah, and I think that circles back to on some of the earlier stuff about like the monitoring, where if people feel like the system is fair or that other people are playing by the rules generally, then they'll play. And so in this case too, like with the punishments and the graduated sanctions, if people feel like they're fair and reasonable given the context that they're operating under, people would generally be okay with it. And then it's like, sometimes they might need to, take water out of turn or whatever, then they can make up for it. And I think it's like, it also points to the fact of like having the community itself make and enforce the rules, because then as long as the community feels that everything's fair, then they're generally probably going to be okay. It's not like some outside force imposing on them. It's like they're all together like, yeah, okay, this seems about good. And that I think that's really important, kind of ties into the other principles too.
I think I'm going to add to both what Livia and Barada said, actually, because she also speaks about how a lot of the punishments are surprisingly low, is the words that she uses in the beginning of the conflict of the graduated sanctions section, and it caught my attention. And then later in this explanation around it, she talks about the loss of reputation for reliability. And in CPRs, there has to be trust between the appropriators in order for there to be, in order for it to continue. And I think that, this loss of reputation for reliability is a sort of sanction. And that's maybe corresponds to why a lot of the sanctions are surprisingly low. And a little later, she speaks about, how there are situations where, in fact, infractions are tolerated, and she refers specifically to, I want to say it's the Japanese villages during the depressions, where infractions were just tolerated and understood because they were not done out of disrespect to the commons; they were done out of desperation. I think that was sort of something also really important to point out, that there are situations where, like the infractions are rules that are also bendable and extendable and understandable. It's one of the rules that have to be taken into the context in which it's happening.
Yeah, and I think that is really important to acknowledge. Um, the We'll move on to the next two since we're running a little bit low on time. The last two design principles are the minimal recognition of rights to organize, which I always equate to this can't be given to you; it has to be earned. This is the idea that the sustainable commons that you get cannot be dictated by governments or laws or anything of that nature. It has to be earned by the people and the participants within the system. Um, if you have a government who says, "Oh, we're going to manage this ourselves," well, you're taking away from the people who are actually using that system on a daily basis, and they aren't actually setting their own rules and their own cultural norms and their own social behaviors and their own monitoring systems. And so this rights to minimally organize is saying that we can't have outside pressure to influence the rules of the system or the appropriation rules on behalf of the participants. And the last one, of course, is that these systems are nested within larger systems. And so acknowledging this is very, very important, because whatever CPR setting you're looking at, it is definitely going to be nested within a larger system of use and of appropriation. And while you can look at your internal system as much as you want, you have to take into account the variables that it holds for larger systems in itself. So if anybody has any comments about these two design principles, go ahead.
Well, I think the two are kind of related, in that if you have a nested system, right, you can have high level global rules, but then within that you can nest subsystems that then allow contextual enforcement at a more local level. And so I think that kind of ties into the right of the appropriators to design their own institutions locally within the context of the global scope of, like, I don't know, whatever society, country, state, city thing. And so I think the two kind of play in tandem and are very related.
Also, for me, like trying to contrast with the reality that we're living now, I think that that's one of the points that all the blockchain ecosystem is working on, and is to be able to nest between themselves, and not only to have the different decentralized organizations, but to have also a connecting environment that can help all of them with their own inner problems and inner needs. So yeah, I think that is something that we have to keep working on, and is the ability to nest these CPR institutions globally.
Should we close for having some time to shuffle?
Yep. Let's do the pan.
Do the pan.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you so much, Nate, for facilitating. That was great.
Yeah, really great job.
Okay, so numbers as is showing up on my screen. Mateo 1, Nate 2, Tim 3, Griff 4, Jeff 5, Juan 6, Kimberly 7, Senti 8, Tonga 9, Zaptimus 10, Barata 11. And I'll add Kate and James here because they were here for most of the call.
And Livia.
And
yourself.
Okay. So Kate 12, James 13, and Livia 14. I thought we had 15 people. All right.
Kate left.
Yeah, I included her, but okay, so everybody remember the number? Generate. Number 9. Who was number 9?
It was me. Okay, I will have to read this week.
Nice work.
Congrats, Tonga. Okay, that's cool. That was an incentive for you to read next week. You see, we're already applying some principles.
Is the chapter like not too long, or we can split it, or is it okay? I don't know.
I'm going to suggest
yeah. So next
again, if we could split
Just split
chapter
it
4 in 2 parts. Yeah, there seems to be something, I haven't read it yet, but there's like the preface, and then there's the litigation game, and that goes up to page 127, and then 127 to the end of the chapter is the entrepreneurship game. It seems like it might be sort of a natural break between the two. I think I would have a very hard time reading the full chapter before next week, but if everyone decides that that's what we want to do, then I'll do the best I can. But I would propose we split it if that's
It's a 40-page chapter, is a big one too. We could also split it. I don't know how people were feeling on the timing that we finished the book. That was my only concern, but I think it makes sense to split so more people have the chance to read it. Does anyone has an objection? Cool. So let's split it. So we read until
there's a heading
until
called
the entrepreneurship game.
What is the heading? Sorry.
The entrepreneurship game.
Okay.
So we read until page 26.
Yeah, 127, starting of the next one, right? The entrepreneurship
Yeah.
game. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So we'll just do a screenshot again.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Okay.
Does anybody want to facilitate the next session?
Am I supposed to do it? Yeah, right?
You're not supposed to do it. You can do it if you want.
Do it.
Yeah, I can do it.
Yeah, okay, cool. Okay, so Tonga is going to take the next chapter. Cool, thanks everyone. See you next week.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Nate.